What's going on YouTube? This is Chris Cooley. I'm coming here today to talk about a Nakamichi 500 tape deck repair. This was something that I've needed to do for a while. The power switch on this particular device will not stay down all the way. So previously it was kind of held in place with some tape or a rubber band or something of that sort. Just keep in mind while disassembling any type of electronics like this, high voltage capacitors and things like that are always a risk. Risk of electric shock. So just be very, very careful when taking apart any sort of device like this. As you can see, looking inside here, lots of high voltage capacitors. So we're taking apart the wooden sides here, and I had a request on Instagram to disassemble this particular tape deck. So the Instagram user has a similar tape deck and was curious to know how to get these off. Really, really simple. There's just one screw holding them in place, and they just attach to the side with a metal bracket. Super easy to disassemble and take apart. Taking off the other one here. So as you can see here, there's just a metal bracket attached to these wooden sides here that are holding them to the tape deck. And we're taking off the front panel here. Just 3 screws on the bottom side of the tape deck holding it in place. Top side of that panel too, there are also 3 screws that hold it in place. Going along the still on the underside, going along the left and right sides of the device, pulling out the screws that will release the top of the deck. Pulling off the plastic covers for each of the channels here. Pulling off the top of the plastic cover of the device. So as you can see here, the power switch just refuses to stay down. Not a huge deal, but something we can easily take care of with a replacement switch. So we'll take off those top screws for the front cover as mentioned before. Just 3 screws holding it in place. So we need to, in order to get to the power switch, we just need to take off these 2 screws here that are holding the input jacks and the output jacks on the front of the device. Those are the left and right mics and the headphone out. Or excuse me, the blend mic. So left and right mic input and blend mic input. Now that this is loose, we should be able to get to the power switch a little bit easier. I should mention that I've disassembled this once already, and you can see here there's the bottom side of the power switch. But as I was saying, I've already disassembled this once before. I reassembled the device just for the sake of making the video. So you can see there's 1 screw down there left holding the power switch on or in the case. And voila, power switch has now been pulled out. You can see that it's pretty mangled from years of use. I believe this particular tape deck was made in 1972. So, and when I received it, while it was in fantastic condition, it does have some signs of wear. Here's a replacement switch I ordered from Germany. I'll place a link from the seller on eBay in the description of the video. The top of the power switch comes off quite easily. And you can see here it refuses to stay in place, and the new switch functions beautifully. So there's some minor differences with the old switch and the new switch, but nothing that I don't think we can take care of here. In fact, after everything was said and done, as you'll see here, the new switch, while I had to have a few modifications done to it, works perfect. So just pulling back the plastic sheathing here, I wasn't sure whether these joints were soldered on or whether or not they were quick disconnect joints, but I quickly found that they were soldered joints. And unfortunately, I didn't have my soldering iron with me, so I had to wait until the next day, grab it, and then I could start desoldering these joints. So here we are next day. I started working on desoldering each one of these joints. It was a little bit of a pain. The solder was surprisingly very easy to melt. Just needed a really hot iron. I got a really cheap iron off of Amazon some time ago, and it worked perfectly for what I needed here. Hindsight being 2020, I would have just cut these right at the joint, and you'll see here in a couple of minutes. That's ultimately what I did to finish taking this apart. I ended up ripping one of the joints off, and yeah, just had to cut that off there. It was becoming too much work. So here we're looking at how we're going to start building the new switch, basically. So you could see there's some minor differences. The front and the back of the switch are a little bit different, but nothing terrible. So here, I know that I need to take the top of the switch off. That plastic part on the top of the switch needs to be removed so that I can place the new chrome, or the original chrome button, back on. I did not realize, however, how difficult this would be. It was already glued in place, and I managed to break the first switch, unfortunately, just trying to remove the top. Rather unfortunate, but I did happen to buy 2 switches, so thank goodness. This would have been a lost project had I not. Alright, so I had the new switch here. I decided to tackle this in a little bit of a different direction a second time around. This original bracket on the new switch I knew would not be compatible with what I was working on, and I would need to salvage the bracket from the old switch. So here I'm starting to work on pulling the, or just replacing that bracket on the new switch. There's some very small components here that are required for this switch to function. So here I'm removing some of those bits and pieces in order to save, so I can put the switch back together. Again, trying to figure out how to get that plastic piece off. I ended up just cutting it off with a set of wire snips, and it didn't come off exactly the way I wanted, but I eventually got all of it off. The top of it was a little bit crushed and a little bit melted, but it did work exactly the way I needed it to after all was said and done. So here I'm removing the old bracket from, or the original bracket from the old switch. I ended up just basically cutting off the top of the old switch in order to get to it. Trying to salvage the switch in any way at this point was kind of pointless. It was already broken. So here I'm kind of trying to evaluate how I'm going to get the new bracket on. I've already removed the old bracket. I ended up just cutting the old bracket off of the switch. Well, I ended up cutting the new bracket off of the new switch so that I could put the old bracket on the new switch. Surprisingly, these switches are pretty easy to disassemble. They're relatively simple components. Here we're putting the old bracket on the new switch. Trying to rebuild it as it was originally built. So here I'm looking at how I'm going to replace some of those very small components. There's a pin inside of this switch that is required in order to hold the switch in the down position, when you push the switch down, when you activate the switch, and there's nothing more than a very, very small piece of aluminum that holds that pin in place. So here I'm just replacing that pin. You could probably hear my computer fan in the background here as I'm watching the video and recording. All right, so lesson learned here, whenever you're using a pair of pliers and springs, always be very, very careful, otherwise you will lose your spring, as I did here. I ended up finding it about a day later. It was somewhere else in the bedroom that I work in. But yeah, kind of startled me a little bit there. Thankfully, I was able to pull the spring from the broken switch. Yeah, this worked out okay. But again, had I not had a spare switch, I kind of would have been screwed here because I had already destroyed the spring from the original switch. So kind of assembling everything back together at this point. Had to do a lot of finagling to try to get the switch to work. As you can see here, I'm struggling with it a little bit to get it to actually function the way it needed to. Turns out that the little black spacer that was in this switch was putting a little bit too much pressure on the spring and would not allow the switch to move up and down as it needed to. So I just ended up removing that spacer and putting everything back together, and it functions just the way it needed to at that point. Quite happy with the result here. And putting that little chrome piece back on top, and voila, we are ready to go. Back in action. Alright, so here I'm just simply soldering everything back into place. Just if you're going to attempt a repair like this, just keep in mind that you'll need to be mindful of which wires go on which terminals. I did make sure to take pictures of this before I did it, or removed the old switch so that I wouldn't have any issue with this. I'm not a master solderer here, so if you have anybody out there who's really good at soldering and you're saying that there's a better way to do this, you're right, there probably is. I've only soldered a handful of times before, so I consider myself where I'm at pretty good. So just a little bit of heat shrink tubing on a couple of the wires. Bit of a blowtorch, shrink those down, and we're ready to start assembling everything back together. So getting everything back into the case is pretty easy. The switch itself is just held in place with 3 screws, 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. So here we just go ahead and throw the 2 screws in the top and drop our screwdriver in the process. And I'm not sure why I decided to put the foam back on the switch. It wasn't there before, and you'll see later on I ended up putting it back where it belonged on one of the flip switches. But yeah, so putting the switch cover back into place on the inside. A little bit of a pain to do, just because the screw that holds everything together is kind of deep down into the device, and here I'm moving that piece of felt back onto the flip switch where it belongs. And I'm going to test the switch to make sure it works before we put everything back together, because if it didn't work and I had everything back together, that would kind of suck. So very happy with the result here. Switch works just as expected. And now we start the reassembly process. So we're putting that front cover back on, starting with the top screws, just 3 screws that go across the top. And the same on the bottom, 3 screws just going across the bottom there. Throw the top cover on and work on those edge screws there. Just 4 that go around the outside. Happen to find that missing screw. Throw on our plastic covers back on. And replacing our wood sides. At some point I'm gonna make some custom wood sides. I really like a natural wood finish. I'm not a huge fan of this white finish here, but still waiting on trying to find some wood to do that with. I'll probably do some burled maple or something pretty unique. I realize that's kind of taken away from the vintage bit of this tape deck, but I think it'll give it some really nice character. And we're throwing the back cover on. So this is it, last step. 4 screws that hold the bottom on. And that's pretty much it. So now we've got a power switch that works well, and we're going to listen to one of the best Pink Floyd tapes there is, The Wall. And we'll have to rewind it first. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this video was informative. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and please consider subscribing to this channel. There will be a lot more videos like this to come. Thank you so much.